Good evening, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Agnes. Tonight I want to ask you something a little different. Is there something from your past, a moment, a conversation, a face, that you never quite forgot, even when you thought you had? We carry more than we realize. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these quiet stories, please subscribe. It means everything to a small channel like this. Now, settle in. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The particulars of an October morning. The village of Chipping Aldwick woke slowly on the 14th of October, the way it always did in autumn, not all at once, but in careful increments, like something emerging from long sleep. The light arrived late and stayed low. The color of pale honey spread thin over the rooftops, and the elm trees along the high street had already begun their annual surrender, releasing their leaves with a kind of practiced indifference, as though they had done this so many times that grief had long since been replaced by routine. Miss Jane Marple had been awake since 6:30. She had taken her tea at the small table by the window that looked out onto the garden, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies were holding their pale purple ground against the advancing cold, and she had watched the morning assemble itself with the contentment of someone who has made peace with October and all its implications. There is a particular quality of stillness that belongs only to the middle weeks of autumn, not the dramatic stillness of deep winter, which feels like absence, but a full stillness, the stillness of a world that has said everything it meant to say, and is now simply listening to the echo. She had letters to write. She thought, some bulbs to attend to in the border before the ground hardened, though whether she would manage both in the same day was another matter. At 81, Miss Marple had arrived at a practical relationship with her own energy. She noted it in the morning. She spent it wisely across the hours, and she did not mourn it when it ran out sometime in the afternoon. There were worse arrangements. It was on her way to the post office, letters in hand, wearing her good gray coat, the one with the deep pockets she valued for entirely practical reasons, that she noticed the van.it was parked outside Aldwick House, the old Haverston property at the top of Church Lane, and it was not the first van of its kind that had sat there in recent weeks. But this one was different. The others had been tradesmen, plasterers, painters, the electrician from Bromfield, whose van had Sparks and Sons painted rather ambitiously on the side. This van was plain white. It carried boxes, visible through the open rear doors, and a young man in a brown jacket was carrying those boxes carefully inside, one by one, with the methodical attention of someone moving in rather than doing work. Miss Marple paused at the corner of Church Lane and the High Street and looked for a moment, as she always did, with the particular attention of someone who has learned that pauses are rarely wasted. Aldwick House had been empty for 11 months, since the death of old Dr. Cresswell in the previous November, who had lived there alone for longer than most people in the village could clearly recall. The house had gone to a nephew in Edinburgh, and there had been the usual murmuring. Would he sell? Would he come? The solicitor's office in Bromfield had received the occasional inquiry, or so Miss Marple had gathered from Mrs. Partridge, whose daughter-in-law worked there 2 days a week, and now here was a young man with boxes. Miss Marple continued to the post office. She exchanged a few words with Margaret Doyle behind the counter, posted her letters, and purchased a small book of stamps she did not particularly need. She mentioned, in the natural course of conversation, that she had noticed some activity at the old Haverston property. Said Margaret, sliding the stamps across the counter. Yes, there's been someone staying there this past week, I think. Not the nephew, someone else. A woman, I've heard. Younger. No one seems to quite know. Ah, said Miss Marple pleasantly. She walked home through the churchyard, as she often did on fine autumn mornings, because the path was shorter and because she found the company of old stones restful rather than melancholy. She read a few inscriptions, as she always did. She noted the date on a particular stone that she passed regularly. 1963, a year she always registered with a small internal notation she had never quite examined. And then she walked on, through the lich gate and up the lane toward her own front door. She was nearly at her gate when the feeling arrived. It was not a thought. Not yet. It was something earlier than thought. The internal sensation of a filing system shifting, of something that had been stored in one arrangement beginning, very slightly, to rearrange itself. She had felt it before, over the years, and she had learned to neither force it nor ignore it. She simply allowed the small movement to occur, the way one allows a boat to turn in a current, and waited to see what direction it eventually chose. She went inside. She made a fresh cup of tea. She sat in her chair by the fire. It was not yet lit, but the chair was warm from the morning light, and she began, very gently, not to think. Chapter 2. The name that returns on its own. The afternoon brought Mrs. Bantry's daughter-in-law, Cecily, who came once a fortnight to help Miss Marple with what Cecily called the heavier side of things, a phrase Miss Marple found both considerate and slightly amusing. Cecily was a capable, broad-shouldered young woman of 34 who had married into the valley and adapted to village life with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had never expected it to be otherwise. She brought news with her the way other people brought flowers, naturally, without ceremony. While she was doing the upstairs hall cupboard, which Miss Marple had managed to avoid confronting for several months, she talked, and Miss Marple, arranging dried seed heads in the study below, listened. "There's talk," Cecily said, from somewhere behind a stack of folded linen, "about Aldwych House. A woman's moved in, apparently, at least temporarily. She's been going round the village asking questions." "What sort of questions?" Miss Marple asked, selecting a stem of dried honesty. "Old questions," Cecily said, with the emphasis of someone who finds old questions more interesting than new ones. "About people who used to live here. Asking if anyone remembers the family that had the house before Dr. Cresswell." Miss Marple placed the stem of honesty into the arrangement and did not speak immediately. The family before Dr. Cresswell. She did not need to search for the name, as it happened. It rose to the surface without any effort on her part, the way certain things do. Things that have been kept just below the level of daily attention, not forgotten, merely submerged. Haverston. The Haverstons. Dr. Geoffrey Cresswell had moved into Aldwych House in 1984, she was fairly certain. Before that, the house had belonged to the Haverston family for something approaching 40 years. And before Dr. Cresswell, the last person to live there had been Evelyn Haverston, the widow, alone, for a period of perhaps 3 years following her husband's death. And before that, there had been the whole household, the husband, the wife, the daughter, the son-in-law who had come and gone, and the particular summer. Which summer was it? When everything in that house had seemed to shift in a way that no one had spoken about directly, but that Miss Marple, passing on her daily walk, had noticed in the manner that she always noticed things, quietly, without announcement, filing it away. "Do you know," Miss Marple said, setting down her stem of dried grass, "whether anyone has told her she might speak to the vicar? The parish records are really quite remarkable. If she's interested in the history of the house, she might find them useful." "I could mention it," Cecily said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Yes, that might be useful." She went back to her arrangement, and Cecily went back to the cupboard, and Miss Marple allowed the name to settle back into its place, not dismissed, not pursued, simply resting where it had always rested. Ready, that evening, she sat with her book, Trollope, which she found reliably soothing, and discovered after 20 minutes that she had read the same page 3 times without absorbing a single sentence. She closed the book. She looked into the fire. The Haverstons. Geoffrey, who had died, when? 1980 or 1981 perhaps. Evelyn, who had survived him and lived quietly in the house until Dr. Cresswell had made his offer, and who had then moved to her sister's house in Wiltshire and been heard of no more, at least by Miss Marple. And the daughter, whose name had been Margaret. Margaret Haverston, who had married a man named Locke, or perhaps Locker, in the early 60s, it would have been, and the son-in-law, the husband, who had visited that summer. Which summer? and stayed for several weeks longer than the visit had appeared to require, and who had departed eventually without ceremony, and after whom Margaret had not, to Miss Marple's observation, seemed very much herself for quite some time. She went to bed at 10:30. She slept well, as she generally did, and in the morning, she found that the filing system had moved again in the night. Not dramatically, not into any final shape, but perceptibly, the way a landscape shifts between dusk and dawn without anyone witnessing the change. Chapter 3. What the Garden Remembers. The morning of the 16th was clear and dry, with a frost that had touched the garden overnight and left it glittering in the early light, every surface edged with the fine white script of cold. Miss Marple went out after breakfast with her basket and her gloves, because the bulbs would not wait indefinitely, and because she found that the act of working soil always did something useful to the interior workings of her mind, not forcing, not directing, simply allowing. The garden was patient with her thoughts in a way that armchairs, for all their comfort, sometimes were not. She worked the border by the south wall, setting in the tulip bulbs she had purchased in September, pressing each one into the loosened earth with the particular care of someone making a small wager on next April. There is always something quietly faithful about bulbs. They require you to believe in spring while your hands are cold in October, and Miss Marple had always found that faith of exactly the right kind. Practical, ordinary, not romantic. It was while she was kneeling there, pressing the third or fourth bulb into the earth with her thumb, that she found herself thinking about the summer of 1982, if she had not decided to think about it. It simply arrived, as things do when one is occupied with something physical and the thinking part of the mind has been left to its own devices. 1982 had been a warm summer. She was certain of that, because she remembered the roses had done exceptionally well, and the heat had lasted well into September. She had been 77 that year, and still walking her full circuit every morning without accommodation. She had walked past Aldwych House nearly every day. The Haverstons in 1982 had not yet been the Haverstons in decline. That came later, with Geoffrey's illness. In 1982, Geoffrey Haverston had been a robust man of 65 or so, retired from whatever it was he had done in London, something in finance, she believed, or possibly insurance. She had never been entirely clear, and Evelyn had kept the house and garden in the manner of someone who had been trained from childhood to do so properly and who found in that training a genuine satisfaction. They were not intimate friends of Miss Marple's. They were the Haverstons of Aldwych House, nodded to on the lane, spoken to briefly at church, and observed in the village with the particular comprehensive attention that Miss Marple applied to everyone who moved through her days. The son-in-law had arrived in June of that year. His name, she pressed a bulb into the soil, his name was Robert Locke. She was quite certain now. Robert Locke, who had married Margaret Haverston in 1963 and who had worked, she believed, she was not entirely certain, in property development of some kind, in London. He had come for what was presented as a holiday, and he had stayed, she calculated from what she had observed, for at least 7 or 8 weeks, which was long. She had thought at the time, privately, that it was long. A fortnight was a visit. 3 weeks, with particular reason, was an extended stay. 7 or 8 weeks was something different. Either exceptional generosity on both sides, or an arrangement that served purposes other than simple family pleasure. She had noticed other things that summer. She had noticed that Margaret, she had seen her in the village several times, had the particular tight brightness of a woman managing something she had been told she must manage. Not grief, not quite. More the expression of someone maintaining composure around a structural difficulty they hope is not visible from the outside. She had seen that expression before, in many varieties and on many faces, and she had learned to trust it as a reliable indicator. She had also noticed that Robert Locke, when she had encountered him once or twice in the village, in the high street, outside the pub, had the easy confidence of a man who felt himself to be in an advantageous position. Not cruel, not obvious, but advantaged, and that the advantage did not appear to be financial. Miss Marple stood carefully, her niece making their usual commentary on the subject of cold mornings, and moved along the border to the next gap. She had filed all of this in 1982, and it had stayed filed because there had been nothing in it that required action, no visible harm she could have named, no crime she could have identified. Things were as they were. She had simply noted them, the way she always did, and continued on her walk. But now a woman had moved into Aldwych House asking questions about the Haverstons. And the filing system, which had no sense of urgency and no interest in dramatic timing, had begun, in its own unhurried way, to retrieve. She gathered her basket and went inside to wash her hands. Chapter 4. The photograph in the charity box. The village's autumn fair, a modest affair in the parish hall, organized by the Women's Institute with the participation of several other groups, took place on the 17th, and Miss Marple attended, as she always did, not because fairs were especially to her taste, but because they were, she had long understood, one of the primary mechanisms by which a village processed and distributed its information. If you wished to know anything about the current state of Chipping Aldwych, you went to the fair, bought something you did not need, and listened to 4 or 5 conversations simultaneously while appearing to examine homemade preserves. She bought a jar of plum jam, a small watercolor of the church done by someone who had talent for color, if not quite for proportion, and a pale green tea towel embroidered with birds. She spoke to the vicar, to Mrs. Partridge, to old Tom Ellerbeck, who ran the remaining farm at the end of the valley and who had been there longer than anyone. She heard 3 separate accounts of the woman at Aldwych House, none of which agreed on all particulars, but from which a composite emerged. She was perhaps 55, with dark hair, and she was asking specifically about a period in the early 1980s. She had spoken to Dr. Simmons's receptionist, who had been young here in those days, and to Mrs. Fowler's elderly mother, who had worked at the pub.it was at the second-hand table, managed by the Church Restoration Fund. That Miss Marple found the photographed IT was not remarkable in itself. A small print in a cardboard frame, the kind sold in abundance at summer fairs, and found its way, through the ordinary movements of time, to charity tables with some frequency. It showed a group of people on what appeared to be a lawn, a garden, in summer, the sunlight flattening the background into a soft blur. 6 or 7 figures. She almost set it down. She did not set it down. She held it more carefully and looked at the figures. It was the garden of Aldwych House. She was nearly certain of it, because the wall at the back had a distinctive line of coping stones she had seen from the lane for years and would recognize anywhere. And the figures, though small and somewhat blurred, included, on the right-hand side of the group, standing slightly apart, a man whose posture she recognized before she had time to identify why. Easy confidence. The slight rearward lean of someone who considers himself to be at an advantage. Robert Locke, she believed, though the photograph was too small to be certain of features. Standing apart from the group at what might have been their garden party, wearing a pale jacket, slightly turned from the camera, and next to him, not quite touching, a woman who was not Margaret. Miss Marple turned the photograph over. On the back, in a hand that had faded to the color of old grass, was written, Aldwych House. July 1982. She purchased the photograph for 20 pence. She put it in the deep pocket of her gray coat. She finished her circuit of the hall, spoke to the vicar about the Restoration Fund with every appearance of sincere engagement, and walked home in the thin October light. She sat in her study with the photograph under the good reading lamp and looked at it for a long time. The woman beside Robert Locke was not Margaret. She was younger, possibly by 10 years, with a lightness in her bearing that was different from the managed composure Miss Marple had seen on Margaret's face that same summer. And she was looking not at the camera and not at the garden, but at Robert Locke, with an expression that Miss Marple, who had spent 81 years reading expressions, found she could read without any difficulty at all. She set the photograph on the table beside her chair, so there had been that. She had half suspected it in 1982 and had filed it as a possibility rather than a certainty, because she had had no evidence and no reason to do otherwise. Now she had a photograph, and the filing had shifted from possibility to probability, and the question that she had not previously known to ask, had not known there was anything to ask about, had begun to take shape. Why was someone at Aldwych House, 40 years later, asking about the Haverstons? Chapter 5. The house itself. On the morning of the 19th, Miss Marple walked past Aldwych House. This was not extraordinary. She walked past it several times a week, on her regular circuit of the village, because Church Lane was one of the 3 routes her circuit could take, and she rotated them according to mood and weather. Today she had chosen Church Lane because the light was doing something particularly fine with the upper windows of the church tower, and because she had a small errand at the sexton's cottage at the bottom of the lane, and because she acknowledged this to herself without drama. She had decided to look at Aldwych House properly. She walked at her normal pace, which was not slow, but which left sufficient time for the kind of looking she meant. The house presented itself as it always did, a solid Georgian structure, 3 bays wide, with the gate pillars that had never quite been repaired after the delivery lorry incident of some years ago. The front garden was still in the state Dr. Cresswell's tenancy had created, which was to say, orderly but not inspired, a garden maintained by obligation rather than love. Under the Haverstons it had been better. Evelyn Haverston had understood roses. The van was not there this morning. But lights were on in the front room. She could see the warm yellow of a lamp through the gap in the not-quite-drawn curtains, and the front door, though closed, had a quality of recent use, a slight disturbance to the mat, a small package against the step. Miss Marple paused at the gate, as one reasonably might, to look at what had been done to the front garden. The current occupant, whoever she was, had cleared one of the overgrown beds along the front wall, and in doing so had uncovered something that had been concealed beneath ivy and self-seated elder for what appeared to be a substantial period of time. That it was a small stone, set into the ground at the base of the wall. Not decorative, too plain for that, too deliberate. The size of a good book, smooth, unlettered. The kind of stone that, in a garden, signifies something put to rest. Miss Marple looked at it. In 40 years of passing this gate, she had never seen it, because in 40 years of passing this gate it had been under the ivy. The ivy had been there as long as she could remember. It had been there, certainly, in 1982. It may have been there before 1982, because ivy of that established thickness does not grow overnight. But it had been there when Robert Locke had stayed for 7 or 8 weeks. She was not leaping. She was noting. The stone was simply a stone in a garden, possibly placed by Evelyn Haverston in memory of a pet, possibly placed by anyone for any number of unremarkable reasons. Stones in gardens meant many things, most of them ordinary. But there it was, under 40 years of ivy, and here was a woman asking questions about the Haverstons, and here was the filing system of Miss Marple's mind. Turning the pieces in careful hands, she continued down the lane. She delivered the sexton's cake tin, which she had borrowed in September for the church lunch, and which she had been meaning to return since. She admired his dahlias, which were still extraordinary. She walked home. She stood in her hallway for a moment before removing her coat. Some things return, whether you invite them to or not. She said it to herself only, in the private and interior manner of someone verifying a thought rather than expressing it. And then she hung up her coat, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. Chapter 6. 2 old women and a long afternoon. Agnes Waterhouse had lived in Chipping Aldwych for 63 years, which was only slightly less than Miss Marple's tenure, but which Agnes had always carried with a proprietorial weight that Miss Marple found entirely understandable. She was 84 and remarkably sharp, and she had been, in the years that mattered, the kind of woman who knew everyone's business not through nosiness, but through the simple, inescapable consequence of being embedded in a place. She had helped at the school, served on every relevant committee, organized things, carried things, noted things. She was the village's memory in the way that unofficial records often are, not written down, not archived, but preserved with complete fidelity in the mind of someone who had found, over time, that forgetting was something she simply did not do. Miss Marple went to tea at Agnes's cottage on the 20th, as she did every third week, and they sat in Agnes's front room with the fire properly lit, and the tea very strong, and the plate of biscuits neither of them ate very many of, but both of them appreciated having there, and they talked, as they always did, about a great variety of things. The weather, the fair. Agnes had not attended due to her hip, but had heard about it thoroughly. The new family at the mill cottage. The state of the church roof, which was an ongoing narrative of considerable complexity. And then Miss Marple said, quite naturally, "I believe someone has moved into Aldwych House temporarily," asking questions about the old days. Agnes poured more tea. "I heard that," she said. "I had a letter, as a matter of fact." Miss Marple looked up. "From a solicitor," Agnes said. "In London." "Not from the woman directly. The solicitor wrote to say that a client of his was conducting research into the Haverston family. He said research, which could mean nearly anything, and that they understood I had been a long resident of the village and wondered whether I might be willing to correspond." "Did you reply?" "I haven't yet," Agnes said. "I wasn't certain what they wanted to know." They sat with that for a moment. "The Haverstons," Miss Marple said, as though simply repeating the name for the pleasure of its sound. "Geoffrey and Evelyn. And the daughter, Margaret." "Margaret Locke," Agnes said. "She married that man." "Robert Locke." "Yes." Agnes set her cup down with a particular deliberateness. "I never cared for him." "No," said Miss Marple. "That summer," Agnes said. She did not specify which summer. She did not need to. "He was here a great deal longer than he ought to have been, for what it was." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I noticed that." "And there was the girl," Agnes said. "The young woman he'd brought along, or who arrived, or however it was managed. She stayed in the village for a time. At Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house, I think. Mrs. Fenwick's been gone 20 years and more, so." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Do you recall the young woman's name?" Agnes looked at the fire. It was the look of someone not searching but simply waiting, the way you wait for a word that is on its way. "Claire," Agnes said finally. "Claire something. I can't bring the surname. She was perhaps 25, 26. A pretty girl. Too much of herself left open, if you take my meaning. She was in love with him, plainly, and he was a man who knew how to make a situation work in his favor." "Did she leave the village?" "At the end of the summer. Robert Locke left in August," Agnes said, "and the girl left around the same time. And Margaret stayed, and was not herself, and then things were more or less as they had been, except they weren't, of course. They rarely are." She looked at Miss Marple directly now. Agnes Waterhouse had always had very clear gray eyes, and age had not dimmed them. "What have you made of it?" she asked. "I'm not entirely certain," Miss Marple said. "The stone in the garden gave me pause." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, and then nothing more. And in that single syllable, Miss Marple heard what she had suspected, not a confirmation of detail, but a confirmation of gravity. Agnes had known it too, in the general way of someone who senses weight without being able to put their hand directly on the thing that carries it. And she had filed it also, and the filing had remained open, incomplete. They finished their tea. Miss Marple complimented the fruitcake, which was genuinely excellent, and Agnes told her the quantity of brandy required, which was more than Miss Marple would have guessed. They agreed about the church roof, and about the new family at the mill cottage. Very pleasant, 2 children, the elder one apparently remarkable at mathematics. And Miss Marple walked home in the early dusk, the light the color of pewter over the fields, and the rooks settling in the elms with their usual decisive noise. She had everything she needed now. She knew it the way she always knew it, not with the brightness of sudden illumination, but with the quieter certainty of something that has been assembling for a long time coming finally into its final shape. Chapter 7. The Circuit. The morning of the 21st was still, with the mist sitting in the lower parts of the valley and the higher ground standing clear above it. The way the village often looked in late October, like a place that has risen above its own weather and is looking down at it with patience. Miss Marple set out at 8, as she always did when the weather permitted, wearing her gray coat and her good walking shoes, and carrying nothing because this particular walk needed only herself. She went by the lane first, then the church path, then the high street, then the long way round past the mill and back up through the fields, which in 40 years of walking had worn a path in her mind as definite as the one in the earth, and which she followed now with the ease of long practice. She walked, and she allowed the story to complete itself. The summer of 1982. Robert Locke had come to his in-laws' house in June, presented it as a family visit, and brought with him, either then or shortly after, the sequence not entirely clear, the woman named Claire. Claire had stayed at Mrs. Fenwick's, nearby, accessible. The arrangement had been, in the language Miss Marple used privately for such arrangements, ongoing. Margaret had known, or suspected. The tight brightness she had worn that summer was consistent with knowledge being managed. And Geoffrey and Evelyn, had they known? She suspected they had suspected, in the way that parents of married children often carry a knowledge they have not been officially given, carrying it at a careful distance from themselves, because to acknowledge it would require action, and action would have consequences, and consequences were not things that 70-year-olds could manage with the same energy they had once possessed. And then something had happened. She walked past the mill pond, where the ducks were engaged in their ordinary morning disagreements, and she thought about the stone. A plain stone, set into the base of the garden wall, under ivy that had grown over it in all the years since. Not a pet stone. There was something in its deliberate plainness that did not suggest the sentimental formality people brought to pets. It was the stone of someone who had wanted to mark something and had not wanted the marking to be read. Claire had left in August, Agnes had said, around the same time as Robert Locke. But where had she gone? Miss Marple turned this over carefully as she walked the field path, the grass wet with dew and the mist still hanging in the ditches. A young woman of 25 or 26, in love with a man who was capable of managing situations to his own advantage. A woman who had come here and stayed through a summer, visible and then not visible, and who had departed. When? Not necessarily when it appeared she had departed. Departed from Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house, certainly. But whether she had departed from Chipping Aldwick was another question, and one that the village, in its ordinary way of tracking ordinary departures, might not have thought to answer. She walked up the rise to where the field met the lane, and paused there as she often did, because the view from this point was the fullest available view of the village. The rooftops, the church spire, the line of elms, and below the church the roof of Aldwick House, visible through its stand of overgrown laurel. The woman now in Aldwick House was approximately 55. Agnes's solicitor's letter had implied a client, and a solicitor did not usually write letters of inquiry on behalf of a private enthusiasm. A client who wanted to know about the Haverstons in 1982 at a specific address. A child, Miss Marple thought, would be around 55 now. If the child had been born in 1970 or thereabouts, and had been given away, or left behind, or placed, there were many arrangements for children whose circumstances were difficult in those years, and such arrangements were often made without record, without explanation, without the kind of clarity that would have made subsequent tracing straightforward, but not always without someone knowing, and perhaps not without a small plain stone set into a garden wall, under ivy, in the year 1982. She descended the rise slowly, watching where she placed her feet on the slippery grass, and let the full shape of it settle into its final arrangement. Not a great dramatic crime, not in the way that word usually presented itself. Something older and stranger and sadder, a life obscured, a origin buried under 40 years of ivy and silence, and someone, now, at this late date, trying to find what had been left behind. Robert Locke, she thought, had died some years ago. She had a dim memory of hearing it mentioned, a decade ago, possibly more. He was beyond accounting. But the accounting was not the point, or not all of the point. The point, for the woman at Aldwych House, was more basic than that. It was the simple and ancient need to know where one had come from. She felt, walking home through the lane in the October light, neither triumph nor anger. She felt the quiet weight of something finally assembled, and, beneath it, a sadness of the particular kind that comes from understanding a long human silence at last. Chapter 8. What Miss Marple Knew. She went to Aldwych House on the afternoon of the 22nd. She had debated with herself, in the honest way she always did, about whether to go at all. She was not certain of every particular. She might be quite wrong about several of them. The stone could be entirely innocent. Agnes's yes might have indicated nothing more than a general sense of unease about Robert Locke that had no bearing on the specific thing Miss Marple had assembled in her mind. She acknowledged all of this with the fairness it required. She went anyway, because she had lived long enough to know that when the filing system arrived at a shape this coherent, after 40 years of patient accumulation, it was rarely entirely wrong in its essentials, even if the details required adjustment. She knocked at the front door at 2:30. The woman who opened it was, as reported, approximately 55, perhaps a few years older. Miss Marple revised, 57 or 8. She had dark hair, graying at the temples with the honest gradation of someone who had not attempted to conceal it. She had a directness in her face that Miss Marple found immediately sympathetic. The directness of someone who has spent a long time seeking information and has become, in the process, very good at assessing whether the person in front of them is going to help or hinder. Miss Marple, the woman said. Miss Marple blinked mildly. You know my name. Agnes Waterhouse told me about you. She rang this morning. She said I ought to speak to you. Did she? Said Miss Marple, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had misjudged Agnes's quietness for reticence. Agnes, it appeared, had done her own assembling and had moved rather more quickly. How very sensible of her. Might I come in? The house had been minimally arranged, a camp bed in the front room, boxes of papers on the table, a laptop and a lamp, and on the windowsill, placed with the care of something brought intentionally, a photograph. Not the same photograph that Miss Marple had found at the fair. A different one, larger, clearer, showing a woman in her 20s outside what might have been a seaside guest house, smiling at the camera with the kind of smile that contains a private happiness it cannot quite suppress. Your mother? Miss Marple said. The woman, her name was Helen Strand, she had said, settling Miss Marple into the single upright chair and taking the camp bed herself with no apparent self-consciousness. Looked at the photograph. Possibly, she said. That's what I'm trying to establish. Claire, Miss Marple said. Helen looked at her. You knew her? I knew of her. In the summer of 1982. She stayed here in the village for several weeks. There was a man, a Robert Locke, who was staying at this house as a family guest. I believed at the time that they were close. Helen Strand was quiet for a moment. She had the stillness of someone accustomed to receiving partial information and holding it carefully until more arrived. I was adopted as an infant, she said. In late 1982. My adoption records, when they were eventually released to me, many years later, gave my birth mother's name as Claire Avery. The records were incomplete in several specifics. The father was listed as unknown. She paused. I found evidence that Claire Avery was in this village in the summer of 1982. She died in 1994. I've established that much. She never spoke of this place, as far as I've been able to discover, to anyone who knew her in her later years. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. The fire was unlit in this room, and the afternoon light coming through the window was the pale, thin light of late October, and the house was very quiet. I believe, Miss Marple said, slowly and with the care she always applied to things she was not entirely certain of, that your mother spent the summer of 1982 in this village under circumstances that were difficult. She was not from here, and she was connected, if I have understood correctly, to a man who was not able, or perhaps not willing, to acknowledge that connection formally. She looked at the photograph on the windowsill. She left in August, I was told, which would be consistent if you were born in late 1982 with a pregnancy she may have discovered or confirmed here, or shortly before arriving. Helen Strand looked at her steadily. And the man, Robert Locke. He died, I believe, some years ago, Miss Marple said. I'm not certain of the date. He had been in property development. He was married to a Margaret Haverston, who later became Mrs. Locke, but I have no information about the subsequent course of that marriage. Margaret Locke died in 2010, Helen said. I've established that also. They had no children. There was something in her voice when she said it. Not triumph. Nothing as clear as that. Something quieter. The specific quality of a piece of information that has been located after a very long search and has arrived with both the relief of finding and the weight of what it confirms. There is a stone, Miss Marple said, after a moment. She said it gently, because she was not entirely certain, and because the thing she was pointing toward was not definitive and could not be made definitive at this distance from events. In the front garden, at the base of the wall. It was uncovered when the bed was cleared. I noticed it. Helen Strand said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I saw it. When I cleared the bed. Yes, Miss Marple said. They were both quiet. I don't know what it marks, Helen said. I've thought about it. I don't know whether it marks something or whether it's entirely innocent. I've been trying to decide whether to have it looked at. Properly, I mean. Officially. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I think, she said, that you might speak to someone. Not from here. I wouldn't trouble the local constable with it. There is a very sensible man I have occasionally corresponded with in the county office who deals with things that have aged. He is quite discreet. He understands that old things require a particular kind of patience. She wrote the name on a piece of paper from her pocket. She always carried a small fold of paper for practical reasons and set it on the table. I may be entirely mistaken, Miss Marple said, rising from the chair with the careful arrangement of herself that rising required these days. About a great many of the particulars. My memory of the summer of 1982 is genuine, but it is the memory of an old woman looking at events from the outside, and I am quite aware that the outside view misses much. She paused. I wanted you to know what I had noticed, in case any part of it was useful. Helen Strand stood also. She was taller than Miss Marple by some inches, and she looked at her with the clear, direct gaze that Miss Marple had recognized from the moment the door had opened, the gaze of someone who has learned to see well, because seeing well was the only tool available. It is useful, she said. All of it. Then I am glad I came, Miss Marple said simply. She retrieved her coat from the peg in the hall. Helen had taken it when she arrived, with the automatic consideration of someone raised to manage the small courtesies, and she put it on, and she went to the front door, and Helen opened it. The afternoon had moved, as October afternoons do, from pale gold to something grayer and more definitive. The light lay flatly over the lane and the garden, and the uncovered flower bed was visible from where they stood, and in it the small plain stone, which sat in the October light with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time to be read. Whatever you find, Miss Marple said, pausing at the gate, the village will have been better for your asking. These things do not improve with continued concealment. They simply remain, and cause small confusions in the present that take a great deal of work to trace. She went through the gate and turned up the lane toward home. The rooks were settling in the elms above the churchyard, and the last of the light was doing something quiet and particular with the church tower, and the village lay around her as it always had, its surfaces ordinary, its history layered beneath those surfaces in the way that all human history layers beneath the ordinary, waiting with the particular and inexhaustible patience of things that do not require acknowledgement in order to persist. She walked home at her usual pace. She had a letter to write to the sensible man at the county office. She would not wait for Helen to contact him. It was better to pave the path a little in these matters, and she had the bulbs to finish, and she thought there might be time before the light failed entirely to do another 3 or 4 in the border by the south wall. She let herself in through the garden gate, hung her coat in the hall, and put the kettle on. Outside, the village held its ordinary afternoon. The smoke from chimneys, the sound of the school bus making its circuit, the rooks, the elms, the pale sky with its thin film of cloud, and beneath all of it, beneath the surfaces that could be seen and named and accounted for, all the things that surfaces always conceal, which are not diminished by concealment, and which the patient eye, given 40 years and a quiet morning and the unhurried cooperation of memory, can always eventually read. Miss Marple made her tea. She sat down at her desk. She took out her writing paper. She began,